The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak to motion number 6 on the notice paper in my name. I'm conscious that the chamber has a number of important items to be debated today, so I'll certainly be endeavouring to keep my contributions in support of this motion as concise as possible. And as members will note, my motion is in 3 main sections. Part 1 and 2 provide the context for and detail the recent processes surrounding the current discretionary Ministerial Diaries disclosure system which is in place, as well as summarising the shortcomings of the current scheme. And Part 3 straightforwardly details a specific proposal by which to develop a more rigorous, comprehensive and timely disclosure system for ministerial diaries to deliver on the intent of having such a scheme in the first place. And so, Mr President, for the benefit of members who were elected to this place since the last time this matter was raised in this chamber, it's only fair and appropriate to provide some small amount of context. As stated in Part 1 of the motion before us, on Tuesday 28th of March last year, this chamber resolved to support the proposal that the state government be requested to, and I quote, develop and publicly consult on a proposed Tasmanian mandatory disclosure of ministerial diary scheme. This resolution on the 28th of March 2023 was subsequently conveyed formally to the Premier on that same date. However, instead of the requested consultation process to help inform the most effective disclosure model, the government introduced the current quarterly in arrears system, which is administered by the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Which leads us, Mr President, to the question, so what's the problem? Why isn't the current disclosure scheme delivering on community expectations? And to be frank, Mr President, the current system, I think, is so minimalist it could qualify as demonstrating a more extreme, frugal with facts school of minimalisation quite well. Currently, the so-called routine disclosures are released every quarter in arrears. So, for example, theoretically, in late July is when the ministerial diaries for April, May and June are released. It will be sometime in October before we see those equivalent disclosures for July, August and September. However, the disclosures on the DPAC website are not always released publicly in a reliable, timely manner. For example, both the last 2 routine disclosures were late to the extent that in both instances, stakeholders raised with me the absent diary disclosures for those previous quarters and frustration at the lack of timeliness. And as we know, Mr President, a lot can happen in 3 months. Legislation can be announced, tabled, debated and passed within a 3-month period in this place, meaning there's a very real likelihood that under the current system, the Parliament and the public may not have access to important information and insights into meetings between government and lobbyists, for example, that relate to currently debated legislation. And that does not inspire confidence in government decision-making, which, Mr President, we would all understand to be a key intent of a ministerial diary disclosure regime, the delivery of confidence in government decision-making. So, Mr President, even once the diaries are disclosed, the details contained in the current system leave much to be desired. To take one example, the routine diary disclosure for the quarter of 1st of October 2023 to 31st of December 2023 for Deputy Premier, Treasurer and at that time of that disclosure, the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. In that disclosure, there are a total of 120 entries across the 3-month period, and those included meetings, attendance at events and media events. In a corresponding column, which should contain the purpose of the meeting entries, only 72% of them solely used the phrase various matters or various issues to describe the purpose of those meetings, which, quite frankly, Mr President, is farcical in terms of delivering on the intent of a ministerial diary disclosure regime. To note meetings and have a column that says purpose only to fill it with absolutely nonsensical words like various matters, rather than actually accurate brief description of the topic of those meetings, is quite offensive, actually. In the context of a serious public policy debate, For example, the saga of the New Spirit vessels and the apparent tensions between two state-owned entities, Tasports and TT Lines. Imagine if the following entry in the then Infrastructure Minister's diary disclosures had contained more meaningful information and had been released in a more timely manner. And I'm noting an entry from the 10th of November 2023, which notes a meeting with the then Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, with Tasports and Transport Tasmania Line, TT Line, and the purpose of that meeting was terminal infrastructure. Perhaps some more detailed entries there might have actually started to flag some things to be followed up on in the public interest if they had been available at the time. 10 months later, that entry certainly has broader connotations, I think. Mr. President, time constraints prevent me from going through the multiple examples of obfuscation, the significance of which particularly has become apparent when cross-referenced with later developments and debates that come to light in the public domain. I do wish to mention briefly another matter, a disturbing development in how these frugal with facts, minimalist and delayed disclosures are used to further government obfuscation instead of their intended outcome of transparency and accountability. Members may recall at least two recent examples where questions asked in this place regarding ministerial meetings, which pertained to current matters of public policy, went unanswered, but instead the questioner was told, and flippantly so, in my opinion, to look up the ministerial diary disclosures in answer to the question. In at least one instance, that requested information would be in diaries not scheduled for public release until at least the next quarter. And it's very disappointing and I think an unacceptable approach, one which treats transparency measures and the Tasmanian electorate, on whose behalf these systems should operate, with serious arrogance and contempt. It's due to that arrogance and contempt and blatant abuse, I think, and perversion of the intent of this transparency and accountability mechanism, which has reinforced in my mind that this council got it right on the matter last March. The step that was skipped by government following the passage of the resolution here last year was the critical one of developing and publicly consulting on a proposed mandatory disclosure of ministerial diary scheme to ensure the model is in fact best practice and provides for oversight and compliance requirements. It's now clear that leapfrogging that vital step was a false economy, Mr. President, and was at the expense of transparency, accountability and community confidence. All, of course, absolutely essential outcomes of putting a scheme in place. Mr. President, people are tired of the Orwellian gaslighting to which this government is becoming increasingly addicted. People are fed up with self-congratulatory backslapping by the government for being so very upfront and transparent that occurs after weeks or months of obstruction and information being dragged out into the light of day bit by bit under extreme resistance. It shouldn't take verbal calisthenics to obtain straight answers to questions. It shouldn't take months for factual information to be divulged. It shouldn't take circular referrals from one supposed accountability mechanism of question time to inadequate diary disclosures and then back to question time again. Quite frankly, Mr. President, we have more of a ministerial diaries dissimulation racket than a disclosure model. And for most Tasmanians, the phrase right to information is considered the punchline of a bad joke, illustrated by thick black rectangles across an otherwise blank page. Orwell's Mr. Winston Smith would feel quite at home, I think, Mr. President. A Ministry of Transparency here in Tasmania could easily be Tasmania's contribution to 1984's government of Oceania's Ministries of Peace, Ministries of Love, Plenty and Truth. To put it bluntly, Mr. President, this government has considerable ground to make up to re-earn Tasmanians' trust and confidence, particularly when it comes to genuine transparency and accountability. So this motion before us today presents a real and meaningful stepping stone towards rebuilding that community trust. This motion, in effect, says a year on from when the current quarterly ministerial diaries model was implemented, let's take a health check. It's considered standard and best practice in the community and private sectors to routinely undertake period reviews of the implementation of new initiatives. There's no shame for the government or the parliament to also do so. Rather, it's professional and responsible an approach to take. Further, it's also considered responsible and best practice to consult with affected stakeholders when undertaking such periodic reviews. And that's the crux of the third part of the motion before us today, Mr President. It formally requests the government to provide the Tasmanian community and stakeholders the opportunity to have input into the design and application of a best practice and mandatory ministerial diary disclosure system compared to the current model. What does the community need to see, and within what timeframe, for the disclosure model to inform them usefully and in a timely fashion, and crucially restore confidence in our system of government? That's the key question at the centre of such consultation. To conclude, Mr President, not only do I wish to reiterate what this motion seeks to secure today, but I also wish to emphasise what this motion is not trying to do. This motion is not seeking to impose any particular ministerial diary disclosure model. Today's debate is not about any one individual or grouping of MPs declaring that we know what a viable, mandatory, rigorous and best practice ministerial diary disclosure model should be and should look like, or seeking to impose such a model on the basis of a single majority vote in this chamber. That's not the intent of this motion. Yes, it seeks to establish the criteria by which any revised model should be assessed and consulted, but it's not proposing or imposing any particular model. Nor is this motion imposing a deadline for the requested public consultation to be completed, or by which any proposed reforms to the ministerial diaries model must be implemented. To be very clear, so there's no room for misapprehension or misinterpretation, the motion's final paragraph, clause 3b, merely requires a formal update to be provided to this council by this year's final parliamentary sitting day, the 28th of November. The status of any imminent public consultation process, or those already perhaps underway, can be included in that update as works in progress should that be the case. But in order to comply with the intent and spirit of this clause, it does require that some action is underway that could be reported on back to here by that date of the 28th of November. However, in order to comply, Mr President, I contend it's appropriate accountability and benchmarking mechanism that this chamber has a right to exercise on behalf of the electorate, a report back on progress. And finally, Mr President, the main thing this motion is not is contentious. The fact that routine disclosures of ministerial work diaries is itself now recognised as a standard piece of our transparency and good governance democratic architecture is evident by the fact that a system, albeit a currently flawed system, an inadequate system, but it is currently in place. So it's safe to conclude, Mr President, that the call for a ministerial diary disclosure scheme is not contentious in and of itself. That's been established. This transparency and accountability mechanism is well accepted. However, as discussed, whether and how the implementation of this transparency mechanism meets community expectations is a matter of contention. Hence the formal request contained in paragraph 3A for the public consultation process, which I remind members was agreed to by this chamber in 2023 when we first considered this matter, to seek input into regarding how to improve the current model so that it could meet public expectations should be a well accepted way forward. How could asking the Tasmanian community for their opinion, ideas and input possibly be conceived as contentious? A truly transparent and accountable government committed to the delivery of democratic good governance would not think twice of undertaking such a consultation. It certainly wouldn't take being asked twice to do so. To close, Mr President, the question now before the chamber is not whether Tasmanians should be able to exercise transparency and accountability via a ministerial diary disclosure system. Instead, the question presented by this motion is whether Tasmanians should be asked if they consider the current discretionary model to be fit for purpose, or whether there are potential improvements in design, disclosure, application and timeliness and the mandatory reporting requirements contained therein. Mr President, I commend this motion to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Honourable Member for Nelson in reply.
Thank you, Mr President. And thank you to the Member for Hobart for the contribution and the support of the motion, and thank you to the government for their comments. I'll just pick up on a couple of things from there because I thought it was quite extraordinary, to be honest. We can start at the end, actually, perhaps. It wasn't clear to me where the government was proposing to be considering this broader scheme. of potentially all MPs disclosing their diaries in some format. So while positing it, I don't believe the Leader of Government Business actually spoke about a mechanism to explore the introduction of such a scheme. I would welcome the introduction of a scheme like that. In fact, the government has got a lobbyist framework sitting there developed through a very rigorous process by the Integrity Commission, waiting to be legislated. Been waiting now for over 12 months, Mr President. That scheme's been completed and ready to go. So the government certainly hasn't progressed anything that I'm aware of, any effort whatsoever to progress such an effort for better disclosure across all MPs and across the Parliament. So if the government's intending to come out here and shoot some sort of shot across the bow for the opposition and for other independent MPs and the like, by talking about that, then put up or shut up, I would say. Step up and do it. You've got a lobbyist framework sitting there ready to go, developed by your Integrity Commission. Legislate the damn thing. Just do it. We are all prepared, I would think, to participate in open, transparent disclosure.
I might need another EA though.
Indeed.
Mr. President,
well, perhaps the government could make sure that we don't get excluded from administrative funding for doing so, like we did in the donations bill, Mr President, while they're at it. So if they are going to progress such a thing, perhaps they can make sure it's fair across both chambers of this Parliament. So that's a pretty clear message, Mr President, from me. Put up or shut up. You've got a lobbyist framework ready to legislate, do it. Mr President, it really annoys me when the government gets up here in response to a very reasonable motion like this and pretends that it has an interest to progress something that is actually going to be meaningful when it comes to greater transparency for itself, and instead tries to be intimidatory towards other members and the opposition. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. For a start, this current discretionary disclosure that's being undertaken by the government is not the first time it's happened in this state. It's not. I spoke about it in my contribution last year. Then Premier Bartlett in 2010 began disclosing his diary. That was the first time that happened in this state. It was done, it was part of a suite of integrity measures that Premier was interested in and was pursuing during his time in the role. So this is nothing new in that sense. It's not the first time. And just because they're doing it doesn't mean that they're doing it well, quite frankly, right now, Mr President. Just because this government has begun a discretionary scheme doesn't mean it's anything like what we should be able to expect. In terms of the intent of such a scheme, the intent being confidence in government decision-making and confidence that the allocation of public resources is being done appropriately and not being influenced inappropriately through secret meetings and secret influence. That's the intent. This scheme that we currently have utterly fails on that front. It is not timely. In fact, twice in the year and a half that we've had the scheme in place, twice I've had to issue media releases saying, where's the disclosure, when it's been more than a month past the end of the quarter and no sign of it. So they could at least... I heard the Leader of Government Business talk about the July to September quarter being due to be released by the end of this month. Well, let's see if it is. Because what we'd actually look to in terms of past experience is that wouldn't be released until, if we're lucky, the end of October, if we're lucky, and I don't have to issue another media release calling for it. So let's see, by all means, release it at the end of September on the dot, and that would be at least the best iteration of the current flawed system. Mr President, there are a range of models in the other states, and I'm glad the Leader brought that up. In the interest of trying to be brief in my contribution, I didn't go back and rehash that material, and I won't do it to a great extent now, other than to pick up on two matters that the Leader raised when she spoke about other jurisdictions. She spoke about there being a range of models. Ours is by far not the best of the range of models that are there. So of course we can speak about best practice. Of course we can look across the jurisdictions and identify the elements of best practice. No jurisdiction is embodying all those elements, but we are one of the furthest from it, of the ones who have decided to put a system in place. We are one of the furthest from it.
Again.
Yeah. So, yes, we could emulate the best practice demonstrated by Queensland, for example, by having monthly disclosures. That's better than quarterly. Clearly, that's better practice. We could also make sure that we do what New South Wales did, which was After a year of their mandated ministerial diary disclosure scheme being in place, they undertook a 12-month review, Mr President. Best practice to undertake a review. Just what my motion is calling for, a review. Here we are, 18 months later, time to review. Let's look at how we can do it. It says here in my notes, New South Wales did that 12-month review and it recommended a range of improvements. So there we go. Other jurisdictions accept that you can put a system in place, and then a little bit down the track, you can ask yourselves, how's it working and how can we do better? Nothing controversial about doing that, and everything positive about doing that. So let's just be sensible, look to other jurisdictions, consult with our community about what suits best here, because nobody's saying we have to emulate another jurisdiction in its entirety. Just we need to figure out what will suit here in delivering the intent of this disclosure regime. The government spoke about the RTI review being undertaken as part of the JLN agreement and the like. That's just a red herring as far as I'm concerned here. There's nothing to suggest that that review has anything to do with ministerial diary disclosure. The leader certainly didn't, from what I could hear, confirm in her contribution that the government was intending to include in the review of the RTI Act and the like anything relating to ministerial diary disclosures. You can speak about the other disclosures that are occurring at the moment as a result of the Commission of Inquiry. Again, nothing to do with ministerial diary disclosure. So I think that, muddying the water through talking about unrelated matters is a shame, actually, on this topic. As I said, Mr President, this is an entirely uncontroversial motion. It follows up on the motion that this chamber supported last year and really just asks for it to be delivered in its intent more genuinely. And we've got now 18 months under our belt of the current system that was put in place. It's timely to review it. As part of that, we would expect there to be a process of community consultation. It's just plain good practice. And if the government actually had a genuine interest in transparency and accountability, they would welcome this motion. We would be done and dusted with this discussion. They would welcome the motion and they would do it. And we would move forward knowing that the Tasmanian public will be delivered a better opportunity to have confidence in government decision-making and the allocation of public resources in this state. To resist it is such a telling action from this government to resist this really straightforward, sensible call. So I hope members will support the motion. It's straightforward, it's uncontroversial, it's towards an end that delivers integrity to a greater measure in this state. So I commend the motion to members.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
For the contrary, no.
No.
I think the ayes have it. Orders of the day.